The body in the ashes. The sky is black at midday. A low, thunderous roar rolls through the air as birds vanish from the sky. In the harbour city of Herculaneum, near the Bay of Naples, people have already been fleeing, some to the beach, some to cellars, some into prayer. They don't yet know that the mountain they live beneath is erupting with a violence Europe has never seen before. But in a split second, death arrives, not as lava but as something far worse. A pyroclastic surge, a wall of superheated gas, ash and rock, moving faster than a bullet, hotter than molten iron. And in its path is a man. We know this not from stories or myths, but from what his bones tell us. Decades ago, archaeologists unearthed his skeleton in Herculaneum's boathouses, charred, contorted, and so violently cooked that his skull had exploded from within. His death wasn't peaceful. It was sudden, yes, but it was among the most violent, most painful, and most extreme ends any human has ever endured. This documentary isn't about battles or great empires, it's about one of the oldest human experiences, pain, and how archaeology, medicine, and forensic science reveal its trace in prehistoric death. What can we really know about suffering in deep time? Can bones scream in their own way? And what does the most painful death ever discovered tell us not only about ancient tragedies, but about how we process fear, loss, and fragility today? If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. We begin not with myth, but with ash. Herculaneum 79 AD, the death that shattered a skull. In 2020, a new study shocked the archaeological world. A team re-examined the remains of a man found decades earlier inside a seaside boathouse in Herculaneum. The boathouses had once sheltered residents hoping to escape the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Instead, they became mass graves. Among them, one body stood out. The man's bones were blackened, his posturing extreme. But what fascinated researchers most was his skull. Inside, they found an unmistakable residue, crystallized brain tissue. Even more disturbing, signs suggested his brain had vitrified, rapidly turned to glass under extreme heat, and that pressure from steam expansion may have caused his skull to literally explode. Fact: the vitrification of human brain tissue is incredibly rare and had only been confirmed in archaeological contexts a handful of times. This was among the first from the Roman world. The forensic analysis read like something out of science fiction. The body had been hit by a pyroclastic surge of over 500 degrees, 932 degrees, causing instant vaporization of bodily fluids, fat combustion, and skeletal charring. In one case, iron from the man's blood had leached into the ash beneath him. Scholars still debate whether vitrification caused instant death or a split second of neural agony. Was he alive long enough to register pain? We tend to think of volcanic death as instant, painless, and in some cases that may be true. But not all pyroclastic surges are equal. Some victims at Pompeii show signs of asphyxiation before incineration, suggesting that they suffocated in agony before being buried in ash. In Herculaneum, where the gases were even hotter, some may have experienced thermal shock, literally being boiled alive inside their own bodies. This man's death, then, wasn't just violent. It was transformational. A moment where the limits of biology met the fury of geology. The archaeological horror of Herculaneum's boathouses. Of the hundreds of victims found in Herculaneum, most were discovered huddled in arched boat chambers along the old beach. They had sought shelter from raining pumice and collapsing roofs. But what they got was a wave of gas so hot it could boil meat off bone. One woman was found pregnant, her fetus partially calcified, curled inside her like a secret never told. Children, lovers, merchants, all were reduced to skeletons, many in opisthetonic postures, their backs arched, hands clawed, mouths open. A sign, some researchers argue, of severe neural trauma at the moment of death, when nerve endings misfire in pure, unstoppable pain. In the Herculaneum boathouses, the temperature is estimated to have spiked from 30 degrees Celsius to over 500 degrees Celsius in less than 30 seconds. Clothing vaporized, muscle contracted violently, and yet bones remained. How do we know all this? Through a forensic technique known as histotaphonomy, the study of how biological tissues decay. Burn patterns, bone coloration, and fracture types all offer clues. A bone that turns grey-white under heat tells us it reached over 600 degrees Celsius. The colour of marrow residue tells us whether death occurred before or during combustion. Quirky tidbit: in one case, the metal belt buckle of a victim melted, and recast itself into the surrounding bone. It wasn't just a snapshot of death, it was death becoming sculpture. And then there's the brain. When brains turn to glass. Inside the skull of one victim, researchers discovered a shiny black substance. Under electron microscopy, it was confirmed. Glassy brain matter. The vitrification process likely occurred as the tissue boiled, collapsed, then cooled rapidly in the ash environment. Some specialists argue this suggests a moment of extreme consciousness. Others caution against speculation. Vitrification doesn't necessarily mean survival past a fraction of a second. But it raises an eerie possibility. This man felt his death. Or worse, that he knew it was coming. Pain beyond the physical. But why fixate on pain? Isn't death just death? Because pain leaves marks, and not just in bones. In urban layout, in architecture, in burial practices. Pain shapes culture. Fear of suffering led ancient cities to build temples, conduct sacrifices, make offerings, even write poetry. The death of this man in Herculaneum tells us more than just the speed of pyroclastic surges. It reveals how a community tried to flee, where they fled, and how they clung to hope, hiding near boats that would never sail. His remains are a forensic Rosetta Stone. We read not just his death, but his world. And more than anything, it forces us to confront a disturbing reality. Prehistoric death wasn't just slow, primitive, or heroic. Sometimes it was worse than anything we can imagine. A world on fire. We often imagine ancient disasters in sepia tones, grainy images of trembling peasants, toppled columns and clouds of ash drifting lazily across ruins. But when we peel back the layers of history, what we find is something raw, hot, and terrifyingly alive. To understand the full horror of the most painful deaths in prehistory, we must immerse ourselves in the environments where those deaths occurred, not just the physical spaces, but the emotional terrain as well. And there was no terrain more volatile, more charged with dread and awe, than the one surrounding Mount Vesuvius in the 1st century. This was not a world that calmly awaited the end. This was a world on fire. Campania, before the sky fell. The Bay of Naples in 79 AD was a paradise. Fertile volcanic soil made for thriving farms. Villas dotted the coast. Pompeii, Herculaneum, Stabiae, they weren't backwaters. They were vibrant towns with markets, theatres, aqueducts, and graffiti on every wall. Rich merchants imported spices from India. Poor labourers scraped by, bathed in public thermae, and drank wine so cheap it made your teeth go numb. What they didn't know, or rather had forgotten, was that the mountain they lived beneath had a history. Mount Vesuvius had last erupted over 1,500 years earlier. To them, it wasn't a volcano. It was just a mountain, quiet, green, and vaguely sacred. They raised vineyards on its slopes. No one expected it to kill them. Fact, Pliny the Elder, Roman author and naturalist, wrote about the region's hot springs, never realizing he would one day die in the eruption that made Vesuvius infamous. Still, something was wrong in the summer of 79 AD. Animals were restless, wells dried up, minor tremors shook the streets of Pompeii. Scholars still debate whether anyone suspected these as signs of volcanic activity. The word volcano didn't even exist yet. Vesuvius had no name, no mythology of fire. It was as if the earth was breathing slowly, but no one recognized the pattern. When it finally exploded, it did so with unimaginable force, launching rock and ash 30 kilometers into the air, creating a column visible across the sea. It rained pumice, roofs collapsed, the sky went dark. Then came the surges, clouds of fire rolling down the mountain at over 100 kilometers per hour. These were the killers, these were the nightmares. Living near death, why stay? We ask with modern eyes why anyone would live next to such danger. But the answer is the same now as it was then: opportunity. Volcanic soil grows excellent crops. Ports near volcanoes tend to have deep protective harbours. Trade flourishes. Rome's elite built their summer homes here, not in spite of the volcano, but because it was a bountiful place. Life, like death, flourished on the edge. In fact, death seemed to be part of the culture. The Romans didn't shy away from mortality. They painted frescoes of skeletons drinking wine. In Pompeii, one mosaic reads, "Memento mori," remember you will die. But it's one thing to remember death as a philosophy, it's another to face it as a furnace. Quirky tidbit, Some Pompeian graffiti just days before the eruption mocks a neighbour for smelling like rotten eggs. Was it sulphur in the air? Did the town joke even as doom approached? Vesuvius wasn't the first. Volcanic horror stories are older than Pompeii, much older. In Anatolia, Bronze Age settlements show signs of sudden abandonment, layered beneath volcanic ash. In Ethiopia, obsidian tools have been found sealed in ancient lava. Indonesia's Lake Toba erupted around 74,000 years ago with such magnitude that it may have bottlenecked the human population, triggering a global volcanic winter. But in terms of pain, Vesuvius offers something unique: preservation. It surges carbonized wood, flesh, fabric, even food. In Herculaneum, entire shelves of scrolls were turned to blackened cigars, now being scanned with particle accelerators. But more chilling is what it did to human bodies. Skin didn't just burn, it flashed into vapor. Muscles seized, brains boiled. Death occurred on a level we struggle to simulate even in modern science. Scholars still debate whether pyroclastic surges allow for any consciousness during death. Some evidence from Hiroshima and modern burn victims suggests awareness can last seconds, even in total trauma. So when we say the man in the boathouse endured the most painful death, we're not only describing his final moments, we're describing a moment in Earth's fury preserved with almost divine cruelty. The heat that cooked a city. Modern volcanologists estimate that Vesuvius's pyroclastic surge reached over 300 degrees Celsius in Pompeii, but possibly twice that in Herculaneum. By comparison, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius and human skin begins to burn at around 44 degrees Celsius. At 150 degrees Celsius, your lungs sear. At 250 degrees Celsius, proteins denature and cells rupture violently. So what does 500 degrees Celsius feel like? We don't know. No one survives that. But the bodies do tell stories. Herculaneum's victims often have pugilistic posture, a position caused by intense heat contracting tendons and muscles. Many were found face down, arms flexed, mouths agape, as though screaming in silence. One victim's jewelry fused into her bones. A man's sandals were charred into the floor beneath him. And then there's the famous brain glass, a silent monument to what may be the hottest recorded death in human remains. The fires moved fast, but not so fast that pain was absent, just fast enough to freeze it in time. Vesuvius and the myth of quick death. Popular documentaries often suggest the victims died instantly, and that may be true for some. But archaeology tells a messier, more painful story. Some Pompeians fled too late and died clutching possessions. Others were killed by falling masonry before the heat even reached them. In Herculaneum, some skulls show cracks from pressure, not impact, suggesting boiling of the brain before explosion. Pain in this context wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Remembering the fire, today Vesuvius is quiet. Tourists climb its slopes, vendors sell lemon candies and replica mosaics. But deep below, pressure builds. It's not a question of if it will erupt again, but when. We now monitor volcanoes with seismographs and satellites, but back then the warning signs came in cracked walls and strange animal behavior. We laugh at superstition, but perhaps they sense something we've forgotten, that nature rarely whispers forever. This was a world on fire, and one man's shattered skull in a boathouse reminds us that death doesn't always knock gently. Sometimes it kicks the door down, burning, screaming, unstoppable. Bones that refused to lie. The bones were arranged in a strange, sorrowful tableau. Arms bent, skull cocked slightly to one side, spine twisted, not by injury but by heat and panic. At first glance, it resembled a desperate attempt to flee or shield one's face. But in reality, it was something far more haunting, the skeletal echo of someone dying too fast to scream and too slow to escape. This was not fiction. This was a real human being, locked in place by fire, gravity, and time. And their bones? They refused to lie. Forensic archaeology, listening to the dead. In the last few decades, archaeology has gone high-tech. No longer just trowels and brushes, it's now CT scanners, isotope analysis, and forensic reconstruction. We don't just dig up bones, we interrogate them. We ask them what they saw. We listen for the truth they carry, etched in calcium and silence. In the case of Herculaneum's infamous Boathouse 12, where 13 skeletons were found clustered in a seaside chamber, science tells us something the soot and cinders never could. This was not just a death, it was a biological collapse. Carbon residue on bones suggests flesh was vaporized at temperatures so extreme it caused limbs to contract violently. The presence of iron oxide in skull cavities suggests hemorrhaging at the moment of death. In one case, brain matter was turned to glass. a vitrification process caused by temperatures exceeding 500 degrees, possibly 600 degrees Celsius. Mainstream fact. In 2020, a team led by Pierpaolo Petrone published findings on a vitrified brain in Herculaneum, one of the most extreme cases of heat-based trauma ever recorded. But bones don't just whisper temperature, they scream trauma. In a few cases, ribs were found shattered, not from falling debris, but from internal pressure. Imagine your lungs and heart boiling from the inside, building up gas until bone can no longer contain it. Yet, the posture of the bodies, knees drawn up, arms tensed, suggests some degree of awareness in the final moments. Not long, not even seconds, but just long enough to feel the furnace rising. The pain beneath the ash. Here's where the science gets murky. When do you stop being conscious? At what point does pain switch off and oblivion take over? Scholars still debate whether pyroclastic surges allow for any experience at all. Some say temperatures were so high that victims died within milliseconds, their nervous systems overwhelmed before pain could register. Others argue that thermal shock isn't instantaneous, that the brain might survive long enough to feel it. In fact, comparisons are often made to modern burn victims, people who've suffered flash burns from explosions or electrocution. The testimony is chilling.
The pain is delayed. First, you feel pressure, then the heat, then the burning. It's like your body is no longer your own, just fire. Quirky tidbit. In Hiroshima, shadows of people were burned into walls, but some victims managed to crawl for meters before collapsing. The body can move even after death begins. So when we look at the skeletons in Herculaneum, not just one, but hundreds, we must ask, what does agony look like when it becomes geology? Who were they? That's the other question the bones ask. Some victims were rich, rings still clung to their fingers. Others were likely slaves, no adornments, poor nutrition markers, healed fractures from hard labour. The egalitarian nature of Vesuvius's wrath is both ironic and profound. Emperors and paupers burned alike. Isotope analysis shows varying diets, some fish-heavy, some grain-based, hinting at economic strata. Dental wear reveals age and occupation. One woman's spine had curvature consistent with heavy lifting. Another man had arthritic knees from decades of walking Roman roads. One skeleton showed signs of old surgical intervention, a trepanation hole in the skull, likely an early attempt to relieve pressure or madness. It healed, he survived it, but not this. The vitrified brain. Let's return to the most gruesome artifact of all. In 1961, archaeologists uncovered a body lying face down in ash, partially buried near what was once a temple in Herculaneum. The skull had burst open. For years, it was considered a curiosity. Then, in 2020, new tests were run. What they found shocked the academic world. Traces of glassy material inside the skull, consistent with vitrified brain tissue. Under a scanning electron microscope, it showed neurons still partially intact, transformed into glass by heat so intense, so sudden, that the brain didn't decay. It turned to art. Scholars still debate whether this is the only known case of vitrified human brain tissue, but similar evidence has surfaced in high-temperature industrial accidents. It's grotesque, but it's also poetic. This was a person, walking, loving, suffering, reduced to a sculpture of agony preserved beyond death by the very fire that destroyed them. Pain, preserved. So what does this tell us about the most painful death in prehistory? It tells us pain leaves marks. It warps bones. It fuses jewelry. It carves its own kind of memory into matter. It also tells us that death isn't always clean. The popular imagination wants quick exits. Hollywood burns bright and fast. But real death, especially in disasters, is messy. It stinks. It screams. It settles into your bones. And sometimes it leaves behind more than ash. It leaves evidence. Ancestral echoes. Across the globe, other death scenes mimic Herculaneum. The 2018 eruption of Fuego in Guatemala left behind bodies in near-identical postures. In 1991, Japan's Mount Unzen killed volcanologists who documented their own deaths in real time. And then there are the nameless, burned in prehistoric settlements, buried in collapsed caves, sealed beneath obsidian flows. They too knew fear. They too felt the skin peel and the lungs tighten. But only here, on the Italian coast, in a boathouse at the edge of empire, do we find death's fingerprints so vividly etched into the body. Not just one body, but a crowd. A final congregation before the fire came. The bones refused to lie. And we, if we're honest, are still listening.
Ash cities and human shadows.
The ash is deceptively soft beneath our feet. It billows like fine talcum, hiding beneath a hard crust of compacted stone and time. Each step across this ancient deathscape is a step across thousands of extinguished lives, and not metaphorically. The impressions of furniture, of clothing, of limbs are pressed into the hardened volcanic flow like dark negatives. A child's foot, a woman's braid, a man collapsed face down, his tunic still clinging to his ribs. They are not ghosts. They are silhouettes of pain. This is not Pompeii. This is not even Herculaneum. This is one of many lesser-known sites surrounding Mount Vesuvius, a cluster of smaller towns and rural villas caught in the periphery of destruction. Towns like Oplontis, Stabiae and Boscoriale, places where life had been humming quietly, peacefully, until the sky darkened and time stopped. Our story now shifts from the isolated body to the collective suffering of entire communities swallowed by fire. When ash becomes architecture. Ashfall is different from lava. Lava flows, crashes, destroys. Ash descends, deceptively gentle like grey snow, but it builds, layer by layer, minute by minute, until it crushes the roofs it softly kissed just hours earlier. In 79 CE, the first phase of the eruption was not fire, but pumice and ash ejected in a towering column that shadowed the sun. Over 18 hours, it rained relentlessly across the Vesuvian basin, collapsing homes, suffocating livestock, and blanketing orchards with a powdery shroud. That initial phase may have killed thousands, not through fire, through the slow, unbearable weight of accumulation. Mainstream fact. Pumice fall at Pompeii reached depths of over 3 meters within hours. Many buildings collapsed under the load, and still, people didn't leave. Why? Theories abound. Some scholars argue denial, that people didn't realize the danger. Others believe religious faith played a role, trusting that the gods would shield them. Perhaps most convincingly, where would they go? Ancient infrastructure wasn't built for mass evacuation. With roads clogged, carts overloaded, and no emergency response system, fleeing was as dangerous as staying. Shadow rooms and carbonized cries. In many houses across Pompeii and the surrounding towns, entire families were found clustered together, in kitchens, understairs, in wine cellars, not running, waiting. One of the most chilling examples comes from Oplontis, at the so-called villa of Lucius Crassus Tertius, where 54 bodies were found in a storeroom. They had gathered what they could, coins, jewellery, keys, and waited for rescue that never came. Some held children, others wore expressions frozen in fright. One young woman still wore her earrings, fused into her skull. Quirky tidbit. One dog, found curled under a stairwell, was still wearing its bronze-studded collar. Its chain had been broken, suggesting it was freed in a final act of compassion. Carbonized wood tells us which room caught fire. The searing heat left black streaks along walls. At Herculaneum, the seafront boat sheds, believed to be a last refuge, became mass tombs. There, over 300 bodies were discovered, huddled together in desperate clusters, mothers clutching children, men shielding loved ones. Entire families turned to ash, and in a few rare cases, ash preserved expressions, or at least the space where a face once gasped, screamed, or prayed. Casts of the dead, sculptures of final breath. Perhaps the most famous and disturbing artifacts from this tragedy are the body casts. Invented in the 19th century by Giuseppe Fiorelli, the method is now iconic. Archaeologists discovered that as bodies decomposed in the compact ash, they left hollow cavities. These voids were filled with plaster, recreating the exact shape and posture of the dead at their moment of death. The results are astonishing. A man on his side, hands covering his face. A woman curled in fetal position, as if cradling a baby. A teenager collapsed mid-run, leg extended, toes curling in flight. They are not statues. They are negative space, filled with grief. Scholars still debate whether these people died from suffocation or pyroclastic heat. Some argue that the voids indicate rapid vaporization, suggesting death was instantaneous. Others point to skeletal damage consistent with slower suffocation or building collapse. But all agree. The casts represent a gallery of final moments, the world's most tragic sculpture garden. The Ash Whisperers. With every excavation, new stories emerge. CT scans now allow scientists to peek inside the casts, revealing bones, ages, even signs of illness or injury. One man had fused vertebrae, indicating years of hard labor. A woman showed signs of pregnancy. In one child's skull, a partially grown adult tooth had been displaced by a fall, possibly during the chaos. These aren't just data points. They're microhistories, brief biographies compressed into inches of ash. We know now that many of these victims didn't die instantly. The second surge, a pyroclastic flow, hit in the early morning hours. By then, many were trapped in rooms already collapsed by ash. The temperature? Estimated at 300 to 600 degrees Celsius. Death was certain, but it wasn't always immediate. Ash, the great equalizer. What makes these deaths particularly haunting is the indiscriminate nature of the destruction. Roman society was rigidly hierarchical, but in these tombs of ash, there is no difference between slave and senator. Gold rings lie next to broken amphorae. In the Villa of the Mysteries, an aristocratic woman was found alongside a kitchen slave, their final moments spent together, equal at last beneath the volcano's rage. Quirky tidbit. In one villa, archaeologists found a wine cellar with intact jars of carbonized wine. When tested, the stillness of destruction. Unlike other natural disasters, volcanic ash doesn't just destroy, it preserves. It seals in moments like an insect in amber. Because of this, Pompeii and its sister cities remain among the most intimate time capsules in history. The pain is raw, immediate, real. Ash doesn't lie, it doesn't romanticize, it simply records. Every cracked beam, every twisted body, every abandoned tool speaks to a life interrupted, not just by heat but by history itself. Echoes elsewhere, this form of death is not unique to Vesuvius. In 1815, Tambora in Indonesia obliterated 71,000 lives, burying them under a similar layer of volcanic discharge. In 1985, Colombia's Nevado del Ruiz killed 23,000 in a single night. In both cases, many victims were entombed mid-action, caught unaware, their lives sealed in earth. The technology may improve, our understanding may deepen, but the fundamental truth remains: when ash falls, it makes archivists of us all. The frozen spear, ice, bones, and a 5,300-year-old murder, high in the Ötztal Alps, on the border of Austria and Italy. The sun strikes the ice just right. It glitters. For most of the year, this ridge is buried under thick snowdrifts and punishing winds. But in the summer of 1991, a warm spell pulls back the curtain of time. Two German hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, spot what they think is a discarded backpack, or perhaps a fallen mountaineer. Closer inspection reveals leather, bone, and something astonishing: a copper axe. The figure lying in the ice is not modern. He is 5,300 years old. We call him Ötzi, and we now believe he may have died in one of the oldest recorded murders in human history. This section pulls us out of fire and ash and plunges us into ice and bone, into a mystery that scientists are still piecing together, one layer of tissue at a time. The Alpine time capsule. Ötzi is more than a mummy. He is a snapshot, an unintentional freeze frame from the Copper Age. His body was naturally mummified by snow and ice shortly after death, creating a nearly perfect preservation of not only his skeleton and skin, but also his last meal, clothing, tools, and wounds. Mainstream fact: radiocarbon dating places Ötzi's death approximately 3,300 BCE. He was found lying face down, left arm awkwardly bent across his chest, At first, this was thought to be a posture of rest. Perhaps he succumbed to exposure during a storm. But as we've learned more, that theory has shattered like thin ice underfoot. This man was not peacefully frozen. He was violently killed. The autopsy of a prehistoric man. CT scans in 2001 revealed something missed in earlier examinations. An arrowhead embedded deep in Ötzi's left shoulder. The arrow had severed a major artery. He likely bled out within minutes. Even more compelling, his right hand bore a deep defensive wound between the thumb and forefinger, consistent with a last-ditch effort to grab or fend off an attacker. Scholars still debate whether Ötzi was ambushed or engaged in a running conflict. Some argue he was chased into the mountains. Others believe he was attacked while sleeping. Tiny particles in his gut show he ate a meal of ibex meat, einkorn wheat, and fern just an hour or two before death. His intestines suggest a rapid elevation climb, perhaps fleeing, and on his clothing, traces of blood from 4 different individuals.
A man with enemies. Who was Ötzi? His gear paints a picture of someone important, or at least well prepared. He carried a copper axe, a flint knife, a quiver of unfinished arrows, and fire-starting tools. His shoes were built for alpine trekking, grass insulation, leather soles, and netting for grip. The copper axe is particularly revealing. At the time, copper was rare, a high-status item. It suggests that Ötzi was not a wandering hermit, but a man of social standing. Some speculate he may have been a chieftain, a warrior, or even a shaman. Quirky tidbit: Ötzi had over 60 tattoos, mostly simple line patterns on joints and pressure points. Some researchers believe these were early acupuncture or pain relief markings. His last journey, reconstructed from pollen and mineral traces on his body, suggests a zigzagging path through alpine passes. Some locations appear to have been visited multiple times, as if he were circling, unsure of where to go, or perhaps pursued. The final hours. Let's reconstruct, as best we can, his final hours. It's likely early morning. The alpine sun is harsh but brief. Ötzi has just eaten, ibex meat grilled over a fire, possibly cooked by himself. He carries a half-finished bow and a clutch of arrows, only 2 of which are complete. His knife is dull. His fire-starting kit is dry. But he's injured. A fresh wound on his hand bleeds sluggishly, wrapped in grass. He may have tried to sleep. The position of his body suggests he was resting or hiding. But then it happens. A single arrow from behind, into the back. It pierces his shoulder, shatters an artery. He stumbles forward. His body hits the stone. He bleeds out in minutes. He dies alone. The ice claims him almost immediately. And for 5,300 years, he waits. Theories and suspects. But who killed Ötzi? The mystery has sparked 1,000 theories. Was he killed in a clan conflict, a family betrayal, a botched robbery? Scholars still debate whether Ötzi was murdered by a stranger or someone close. The defensive wounds and multiple blood types hint at prior violence. One theory suggests Ötzi may have been involved in a violent encounter days earlier, possibly wounding or killing others. Blood from different individuals on his belongings, notably his cloak and knife, may indicate he fought back, but in the end, he was either betrayed or ambushed. Another compelling theory involves ritual sacrifice. His placement in a high mountain pass, the odd posture, and the lack of full gear, some items were missing, might point to a ceremonial killing. But if so, why the arrow? We may never know. But what remains is this: Ötzi is the oldest known murder victim with physical forensic evidence.
Afterlives in the ice.
Ötzi has become more than a mummy. He's a museum centerpiece, a research subject, a cultural icon. His body resides at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where he lies in a custom-made freezer, viewed through a glass window. Constantly monitored, forever preserved. But his story isn't over. In 2012, researchers discovered his DNA carries a rare blood type and traces of Lyme disease, making him the earliest known case. He also had hardened arteries, indicating cardiovascular problems, and carried ash from fires long since dead. In a world without writing, Ötzi tells us volumes. His wounds are his diary, his tools, his social media, his final moments are forensic drama. And in the silence of the alpine snow, one question lingers. Did he see his killer? Did he recognize the face behind the bow? The ice doesn't say, but it remembers. The Red Lady's secret, a burial cloaked in blood and symbol. Deep within a cave system in Wales, beneath layers of silt and time, lies one of the most haunting burials ever found in prehistoric Europe. The space is silent now, just dripping water, limestone stalactites and the occasional flutter of a bat. But around 34,000 years ago, this cavern echoed with ritual, with firelight, with grief, and with a mystery that still stirs us today. The body found here was not actually female, despite the name, nor was it an accident of time. This was a deliberate, ceremonial burial conducted by people who lived at the edge of survival during the Ice Age. And what they did with this body defies expectations. Buried in red ochre, adorned with beads and mammoth ivory, this figure became known as the Red Lady of Paviland. But what happened to him, and why, may represent one of the most emotionally charged deaths in prehistory. Discovering the Red Lady. The Paviland cave sits on the Gower Peninsula, near the sea. Today it's part of Britain, but when the body was buried here, the land was connected to continental Europe, part of a sweeping tundra that stretched from what is now France to Siberia. Mainstream fact. The Red Lady is a misnomer. The remains belong to a young man aged around 25, buried approximately 33,000 to 34,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic. He was discovered in 1823 by William Buckland, a pioneering geologist and clergyman who assumed, based on the red pigment and grave goods, that the skeleton was that of a Roman-era woman, perhaps a prostitute. But as science improved, so did the story. Radiocarbon dating in the late 20th century pushed the timeline tenfold earlier, landing us in the heart of the Ice Age, and isotopic studies of the bones revealed a diet heavy in mammoth meat. This was no Roman, and no ordinary death. A funeral in firelight. Picture it, a community of Ice Age humans, nomadic but deeply connected, pausing their hunt to bury one of their own. The cave is chosen with care. It offers shelter, silence, and symbolism. The deceased is laid on his side, knees tucked gently to the chest, in the fetal position. Red ochre, ground from iron-rich stone, is spread thickly across his body, turning skin and bone the colour of blood. Quirky tidbit, red ochre has been used in burials on every inhabited continent, often associated with rebirth, menstruation, or the symbolic return to the womb. Around the body offerings are placed, shell beads, tools, fragments of mammoth ivory. Perhaps there were flowers. Perhaps there was chanting, and then the cave was sealed. It's as if they were returning him to the earth itself, wrapped in the colour of life and death. So why is this death so important? For one, it's the oldest known ceremonial burial in Western Europe. Most earlier burials, even of Neanderthals, are debated in terms of intent. But here there is no ambiguity. The ochre, the grave goods, the careful positioning. This was an act of reverence. But more haunting is the question of why such effort was made. Was the man a leader, a shaman, a fallen hero? His bones tell us little about cause of death. There's no visible trauma, no signs of infection. He may have succumbed to illness, or simply the brutal odds of Ice Age life. Scholars still debate whether the ochre in his burial was a local resource or brought from afar. Some argue it came from over 100 kilometres away, suggesting long-range ritual networks. But the power of his death lies not in how he died, but how he was remembered. For tens of thousands of years, the Red Lady lay undisturbed. His body was shielded by stone and darkness. But when Buckland's team uncovered him in the 19th century, they misidentified his gender, age, and cultural context. In a way, he died again, erased from his true identity, transformed into myth. Even now, controversy lingers. The bones were taken from Wales and are held in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. Some Welsh communities have called for his return, seeing him not just as an archaeological specimen, but as one of the first Britons, a symbolic ancestor. And still, His red-stained bones whisper across time. The use of red ochre in burial is one of the most enduring mysteries in prehistoric archaeology. It's not unique to the Red Lady. From burials in Africa to the Levant to Siberia, the colour red keeps appearing, always in grave sites, always with deliberate placement. Why? Some theories point to the symbol of blood, a way of marking death not as the end but a transformation. Others link it to fertility and menstruation, making death a kind of rebirth. Still others suggest ochre had antiseptic properties, possibly slowing decay or symbolically purifying the dead. Scholars still debate whether red ochre served medicinal, symbolic, or both purposes, but its ubiquity suggests it was vital to early belief systems. In all cases, it reflects one thing. These were not mindless savages. These were people who grieved, who honoured, who believed in something beyond the final breath. Echoes in the present today. The Red Lady is not just an archaeological artefact. He's a touchstone. A rare moment when the Ice Age gives us more than scattered teeth or fire pits. It gives us a human story. We see him not just as a set of bones, but as a person who once laughed, hunted, perhaps loved. His burial tells us that the people around him cared enough to pause their struggle for survival and give him a ceremony. And in doing so, they gave us a window into their hearts. Imagine that. Over 30,000 years ago, a young man dies. His community lays him in red pigment, offers gifts, and seals him in the earth. And now, in our brightly lit labs and echoing museums, we study his death as a way to understand our own humanity. He didn't die in war, or disease, or starvation. He died surrounded by love, and was remembered in crimson. Sometimes the most painful deaths aren't the most violent. They're the ones where grief runs deepest, and where the survivors leave behind a message in ochre and stone. We remember you, the children of Windover. Unspoken pain in a silent swamp. The surface of the pond is still, a sheet of brown-black water covered in reeds and mist. Dragonflies hover, mosquitoes buzz, and frogs chirp. But what lies beneath is not just mud or root, it's bone. Hundreds of them, and they tell a story that is both delicate and devastating. The story of children, elders, and entire families laid to rest in the ancient waters of what is now Florida. This is Windover Bog, a site so remarkable, so quietly disturbing, that it reshaped how we think about the death, medicine, and mourning of prehistoric people. Among its most haunting revelations, the suffering and silent endurance of children, injured, sick, disabled, yet lovingly cared for, and ultimately buried with extraordinary tenderness. This is not the story of a single violent death. It's a slow unfolding of illness, trauma, compassion, and in some cases, unimaginable pain. An accidental time capsule. In 1982, construction crews breaking ground near Titusville, Florida, made a strange discovery. Bone fragments emerging from a pond. Archaeologists were called in. What they found defied all expectation. Mainstream fact: the Windover archaeological site contains the preserved remains of over 160 individuals, dating back nearly 8,000 years, making it one of the oldest and best preserved burial sites in North America. Unlike dryland burials, the bog's anaerobic acidic conditions preserved soft tissues, brain matter, hair, and even textile fragments. It was as if the past had been shrink-wrapped, still vulnerable, still very human. A cemetery in the water. The people of Windover used this shallow pond as a cemetery for generations. Bodies were placed in the water and held down with woven fabric, bark, and wooden stakes. They were often laid on their backs, arms at their sides, faces peaceful. And then came the detail that stunned researchers. Many of the individuals were children, some were infants, and some bore signs of long-term disease, injury and pain, but also of sustained care. Quirky tidbit. Some children at Windover were buried with small items, shells, bone tools, even bird bone ornaments, suggesting they were not only mourned but honoured, regardless of disability or age. The girl with spina bifida. Among the most powerful stories is that of a young girl, around 15 years old, who had suffered from spina bifida, a congenital condition affecting the spine. The condition likely left her unable to walk, and possibly in pain for most of her life, yet she lived for years. Her body shows signs of muscle atrophy, but also of sustained nourishment and survival.
Someone carried her, fed her, protected her. Scholars still debate whether Windover society was egalitarian or structured by age and ability. But the girl's survival suggests a society where even the most vulnerable had a place. In a world with no wheelchairs, no hospitals, no advanced medicine, this child was not abandoned. She was embraced. A boy with skull trauma. Another skeleton, this time of a boy about 10 years old, bore signs of cranial injury, possibly from an accident, possibly a congenital condition. The damage would have impaired movement or cognition. And yet, he too had lived long enough to develop adult teeth, to grow into his frame. Someone helped him eat. Someone soothed his pain. Someone loved him. He was buried gently, with care. His body was not dumped, not hidden. It was offered to the pond with the same reverence as all the others. Pain in Windover did not erase dignity. The breath of the ancients. Because of the bog's preservation, scientists were able to recover not just bones, but brain tissue. One adult's remains held nearly half an intact brain. Browned and shrunken, yes, but still structurally detailed. The rarity of this cannot be overstated. Pollen, seeds and plant fibres found around the burials suggest the Windover people used medicinal plants, including yarrow and elderberry, for treating illness or injury. Scholars still debate whether Windover people had formal healers, or whether medicine was communal knowledge passed down orally. No tools marked explicitly as surgical have been found, but there's no doubt they tried to ease suffering. A different kind of death. Unlike other prehistoric death sites, full of trauma, battle damage or sacrificial clues, Windover is quiet. There are no weapons buried with the dead, no signs of execution or ritual killing. Most died of illness, old age or unknown causes, and so the pain here is less sensational, but perhaps more human. It's the pain of chronic illness, the pain of a mother watching her child grow thin from infection, the pain of helplessness, the pain of loss, but also the balm of care, of ritual, of letting go, threads of connection. One remarkable find was a piece of textile woven from plant fibre, buried with an elderly woman. Woven using a complex pattern, the cloth indicated skill and love. Someone had made it, perhaps not just for warmth, but as a shroud of honour. Textile analysis shows that at least some of the fabric had been dyed, meaning aesthetics mattered. Even in death, these people were dressed, not in animal hides, but in beauty. Quirky tidbit, the bog also preserved the oldest known woven fabric in the Americas, showing that 8,000 years ago, humans still cared deeply about appearance and ritual. What the children teach us. Modern archaeologists return again and again to the children of Windover, because in their bodies is the evidence of a prehistoric social contract. These weren't just biological offspring, they were protected, nurtured and remembered, even when it hurt, even when it took time and energy and food. The sick weren't thrown out, the injured weren't left behind, they were buried with love. Scholars still debate whether the Windover people held afterlife beliefs, but the care shown suggests an emotional depth often denied to prehistoric cultures. Pain as a mirror. Windover reminds us that pain, real, chronic, unending, is as old as humanity itself, but so is tenderness, so is community. So is the effort to turn dying into something more than decay. The people of Windover had no writing, no medicine as we know it, and yet they left us a record of empathy in the still waters of a Florida bog. When we look at the small girl with the curved spine, or the boy with the damaged brain, we do not see weakness. We see endurance. We see sorrow. We see a people who understood, even without language, that death is not the end of story, and that pain does not define the worth of a life. The most painful deaths aren't always marked by violence. Sometimes they happen slowly, inch by inch in bodies too small to understand why they hurt, and in the quiet, ancient compassion of those who tried to ease it. Burned alive, the mystery of the Herxheim cannibal pits. The wind howls across the flat land of southwestern Germany, whispering through the low grass like the final breath of someone silenced too soon. Beneath the surface, neatly arranged bones tell a chilling story, not of a burial, of butchery, of shattered skulls, flayed limbs, flesh scraped from bone, and perhaps of fire. This is the site of Herxheim, a Neolithic settlement dating to around 4950 to 4750 BCE, where over 500 individuals, men, women and children, met their end. And while violence is common in prehistoric records, what makes Herxheim so terrifying is not just the scale or brutality, but the systematic ritual that seems to underlie it. Some of these people may have been burned alive, butchered or consumed, not for survival, but for ceremony. This is the dark edge of prehistory where death is not a tragedy, but an offering. a mass grave, or something else. The discovery of Herxheim began like many archaeological finds, as a rescue excavation ahead of construction. But as the trenches deepened, it became clear this was no ordinary site. Mainstream fact: the Herxheim site consists of ditches filled with over 1,000 bone fragments, often deliberately broken and mixed with animal remains, pottery and ritual objects. The bodies were not buried, they were disarticulated, often defleshed, cracked open and scattered deliberately. Some skulls were turned into bowls, many bones bore cut marks, and several had been burned, not in cremation, but during or shortly after death. At first, archaeologists thought they were seeing the results of intertribal warfare or disease disposal, but the patterning was too structured, too intentional. And then came the deeper questions: evidence of cannibalism? The bones from Herxheim show signs that go beyond violence. Long bones, femurs, humeri, had been split lengthwise, a technique known to extract marrow. Jawbones and ribs had been sawn, scraped and charred. There are no indications of hurried burial, but rather a ritual dismemberment. Scholars still debate whether Herxheim represents survival cannibalism, religious sacrifice, or a funerary rite intended to commune with the dead. But here's what's clear: this was not a one-time event. The ditches were reused over time. Victims were brought in from across Central Europe, some from over 400 kilometers away. This suggests Herxheim was a destination, possibly a sacred or feared place where a collective ritual unfolded. Quirky tidbit: some skulls at Herxheim were polished smooth on the inside, suggesting they were used as drinking vessels, or perhaps for collecting offerings. This isn't folklore, this is archaeological data, and it's among the most gruesome we've ever seen from the Neolithic world.
Burned. But how? Among the most shocking finds were bones that showed charring, but only on certain parts: knees, elbows, faces, and often only on living bone. Forensic anthropologists know that burning fresh living tissue leaves different marks than burning dried or buried bones. Some victims at Herxheim seem to have been partially burned alive, possibly restrained while flames were applied to limbs or faces. Scholars still debate the exact mechanism. Were these people tied to stakes, laid in shallow trenches while burning fuel was applied? Were they forced to walk through fire as punishment or penance? Whatever the cause, the intent was unmistakable: to cause pain, not merely death. Who were the victims? Genetic and isotopic analysis shows that many individuals were not locals. They had grown up on different soil, eaten different food, lived under different skies. Some were children, some were old, many were women. They were brought, or taken, from as far away as present-day France, Austria and Poland. Why? Were they prisoners? Pilgrims? Volunteers? Scholars still debate whether the victims were enemies captured in war, members of the community undergoing ritual sacrifice, or outsiders who came willingly to participate in something divine or deadly. There is no clear marker of status. Some had dental wear suggesting wealth. Others had fractures indicating prior violence. A few had healed wounds, meaning they had suffered before. The architecture of death. Herxheim's ditches were curved, forming a rough oval enclosure. Inside this space, people lived and died. The ditches seem to have served dual functions, both defence and ritual boundary. The bone deposits are layered, suggesting a series of events, not a single massacre. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a stage, and across that stage the same act played again and again: restraint, death, burning, cutting, scattering. Quirky tidbit: at least one skeleton at Herxheim was intentionally rearranged after death, with bones placed in geometric patterns, including one with a skull seated upright atop crossed femurs, a configuration eerily similar to the modern skull and crossbones. This was not random, this was art. Terrible sacred art. A culture on the edge. The people of Herxheim belonged to the linear pottery culture, or LBK, a farming society that spread rapidly across Europe after 5500 BCE. They built longhouses, farmed wheat and barley, raised livestock, and then, suddenly they began to collapse. Around the time Herxheim became active, the LBK culture faced massive climate shifts, social upheaval, and resource stress. Violence increased across Europe. Villages were burned. Populations moved. Something was breaking down. Herxheim may have been the ritual expression of that breakdown, a community trying to hold back chaos with blood and fire. Scholars still debate whether Herxheim was a last gasp or a peak moment, the final, desperate bloom of a culture unravelling at its seams. Belief
It's easy to see Herxheim as monstrous, and it is, but it's also deeply human. Pain here was not just inflicted, it was framed, it had meaning. Some researchers suggest that the victims were transformed through death, their bodies broken to release their spirits, their pain a currency for divine favour. Like the Aztecs who flayed victims to renew the sun, the people of Herxheim may have believed that suffering opened the door to something greater. To us, it's horror. To them, perhaps, it was holiness. What remains at Herxheim are fragments, literally. No complete skeletons, only parts. Like the stories, the bodies are shattered, their meanings elusive. But the evidence of pain is undeniable. Ligature marks, blade cuts, burning. People screamed here, people suffered. The Herxheim site is now considered one of the most significant evidence points for ritualized Neolithic cannibalism, possibly the only site in Europe showing this kind of systematic cultural violence. And still, some scientists resist the cannibalism interpretation. They argue for sky burials, predator damage, accidental fires. But the marks on the bones say otherwise. The pattern says otherwise. The fire says otherwise. Herxheim may be one of the most painful death sites ever found, not because it happened in panic, but because it happened with ceremony. In Herxheim, pain was not just punishment, it was a door, a moment of transformation, a sacrament. We do not know what songs they sang, we do not know what gods they called, but we know this: someone died in agony, and someone else believed that agony meant something. And perhaps that's the most unsettling thing of all. Flesh and Fury, the Red Deer Cave Enigma. In the green, mist-wrapped highlands of Yunnan Province, China, a hidden cave mouth yawns beneath layers of limestone. For tens of thousands of years, this cave kept its secrets, bones buried in sediment, untouched by time. But in 1989, Red Deer Cave, also known as Maludong, gave up something remarkable, and something disturbing. The remains were strange, skulls that looked almost human, but not quite. Thick brow ridges, flat, wide faces, long, curved frontal bones. The teeth large and uneven, and alongside them, evidence of burning, char marks, fractures, scorching that seemed intentional. These people died in pain, and maybe even after death, their bodies burned. But who were they? Homo sapiens? A different species? Something in between? This is the story of the Red Deer Cave people, the last of their kind. Or perhaps, the beginning of something else, an unexpected discovery. In the late 20th century, Chinese archaeologists were cataloguing remains from multiple cave sites in southwest China. Red Deer Cave, named for the large red deer whose bones filled it, seemed like just another prehistoric kitchen midden, the leftovers of a hunter's feast. Mainstream fact: the Red Deer Cave fossils were first discovered in 1989, but it wasn't until the early 2010s that analysis revealed their highly unusual features. Mixed among animal bones were skull fragments, partial femurs, and jawbones from at least 5 individuals. Radiocarbon dating placed them at around 14,500 to 11,500 years ago, a period when Homo sapiens had already spread across Asia. And yet, the bones didn't match modern humans. The skulls were archaic, more like Homo erectus or early Homo habilis than our immediate ancestors. Some had no chins, their brains were smaller, but they had lived recently enough to walk the same lands as modern humans. Who were the Red Deer Cave people? The debate exploded in the scientific community. Were these anatomically unique Homo sapiens, shaped by local diet and isolation, or a distinct human species, surviving far longer than previously thought? Scholars still debate whether the Red Deer Cave people were an isolated offshoot of Homo sapiens, a hybrid species, or the final remnants of a previously unknown hominin. Quirky tidbit: some researchers dubbed them the last archaic humans, suggesting they may have survived into the Holocene and might even have interbred with modern humans. One of the biggest surprises was how primitive some features were, traits we associate with pre-sapiens hominins, like the Neanderthals or Denisovans, but here they were, living just 10,000 years ago, when agriculture had already begun elsewhere in the world. They were being burned, the charred bones. Amid the stone tools and deer remains were fragments of burned human bone. Some were cracked, blackened, or warped from intense heat. In a few cases, the damage was focused on certain areas, suggesting intentional burning, not post-depositional fire. Mainstream fact. Red Deer Cave remains showed evidence of burning consistent with cooking fires or deliberate cremation, but no clear signs of burial. There were no grave goods, no ceremonial positions. The bones were fragmented, disarticulated, and in some cases missing key elements, as if someone had removed soft tissue before fire was applied. Was this a case of early cremation, a funerary rite, or something darker? Were they eaten? At least one research team proposed a bold theory. The Red Deer Cave people were cannibalized. Burned bone, human and animal, were often found together in hearths, but only the deer bones were butchered with clear-cut marks. Human bones bore signs of fire exposure but not always cutting. Some argue this suggests ritual cannibalism, where burning substitutes for butchering. Scholars still debate whether the burning was symbolic, to honor the dead, hygienic, to dispose of bodies, or functional, to extract marrow or render meat. One team suggested the people of Red Deer Cave were seen as other, perhaps even feared. Their genetic distinctiveness may have marked them for ritual destruction, especially if they were the last of a dwindling group, or they were the burners, not the burned. That's the trouble with deep history. The fire always leaves smoke, but not always the match. A new species, or ancient survivors? In 2012, researchers controversially proposed a new designation, that the Red Deer Cave fossils might represent a previously unknown species of human. Mainstream fact. The Red Deer Cave people are considered one of the most anatomically distinct human populations from the late Pleistocene, rivaling the Denisovans in mystery. But DNA couldn't confirm it. The bones were too degraded and contamination too great. Without genetic evidence, all scientists had was morphology, and that was weird enough. In 2020, new analysis suggested the Red Deer Cave people may have been a highly divergent group of Homo sapiens, perhaps descended from a very early migration out of Africa that remained genetically isolated. Quirky tidbit. One jawbone found at the nearby Longlin Cave site, sometimes grouped with Red Deer Cave, had teeth so misaligned and molars so large that researchers joked it belonged to a prehistoric vampire. In the absence of hard proof, the arguments rage on. Were they our kin, our cousins, or our prey? The painful end. The burning of bones is significant, not only because of what it implies, but because of how selective it seems. Some individuals were exposed to intense heat, others not. The variation suggests intentional choices. Who to burn, how long, how thoroughly. Scholars still debate whether this selective burning indicates social status, punishment, or disease purification rituals. But one thing is clear. The Red Deer Cave people did not go quietly. Their final moments were spent in fire, perhaps on purpose, perhaps in fear. In a culture that left few clear marks, that silence speaks volumes. A glimpse into human diversity. Whether or not the Red Deer Cave people were a different species, they are a reminder that our human family was once far more varied than it is today. We were not the only intelligent upright apes to walk the forests of Yunnan, and we may not even have been the most ancient. Their strange skulls, their burned bones, their abrupt disappearance. All of it points to a transition zone, where archaic and modern worlds collided, perhaps with violence, perhaps with reverence, or perhaps both. Echoes in the mountains. Today, the people of Yunnan tell stories of wild men who once roamed the highlands, tall, strong, with strange faces and fire in their eyes. Local myths speak of forest spirits and ape-like ancestors, echoing strangely with what science now uncovers in the ground. It's easy to dismiss such legends, but it's just as easy to forget. 99% of our prehistoric story is lost. A single cave, a handful of bones, a few fire scars. These are all we have to rebuild what might have been an entire people. Mainstream fact. The Red Deer Cave site is now under increased protection, and further excavations continue to uncover animal bones, tools, and possibly new human remains. What they will reveal or confirm is still unknown, but for now we can say this. In the forests of ancient China, long after most archaic humans were gone, someone else was still here. They burned, they lived. They left us questions no fire can consume.
Final agony. A child's death had soon here. The snow falls gently, blanketing the Russian landscape in silence. Beneath a low hill near the village of Sunhir, a boy's body lies curled in death, arms crossed, head turned gently to the side. His tiny bones are framed in thousands of ivory beads, each one painstakingly carved from mammoth tusk. He is 10 years old, or perhaps 12, but he's been dead for 34,000 years, and he wasn't alone. Next to him lies another child, and across the burial pit, the body of a man, elderly by Ice Age standards, lies similarly enshrined. All three are dressed not just for burial but for eternity. Clothes decorated with fox teeth, tools placed near their heads, spears, carved symbols, painted red with ochre, like blood made sacred. This isn't a scene of violence, at least not visibly, but something about Sung here is painful, deeply, almost cosmically painful, because what these burials hint at isn't just death, it's awareness of death, and perhaps the very first true mourning we have ever found. This is where we end our story, not in screams or spears, but in quiet sorrow, and a child who never grew up. A burial unlike any other. Sunhir is one of the most astonishing burial sites in the prehistoric world. Discovered in 1955, just east of Moscow, it dates to around 34,000 years ago, firmly within the Upper Paleolithic and linked to early Homo sapiens. Mainstream fact. The site of Sunghir contained the remains of 2 children and an adult male, all buried with extraordinary care and symbolic grave goods, including over 13,000 ivory beads. But it's not just the craftsmanship that stuns archaeologists, it's the precision. Each bead was likely carved over hours or even days, then sewn into garments that covered the bodies from head to toe. The effort required to produce these ornaments has been estimated at several thousand hours per burial. Why would a community invest so much labour into burying children who didn't contribute physically to the group? Why mourn them so deeply, so permanently? Scholars still debate whether the elaborate burials at Sunhir reflect status, religion, or a deep emotional bond that modern humans were only just beginning to feel. But one thing is clear, these were not simply corpses to be disposed of, these were lives remembered. The strange twin grave. The 2 children, one a young adolescent boy, the other a slightly younger companion, were laid head to head in the same grave. They were decorated identically. Yet, DNA analysis shows they were not brothers. In fact, they were not closely related at all. This has raised perplexing questions. Why bury them together in such a symmetrical, deliberate way? Were they symbolic twins, ritual proxies, sacrificial? Quirky tidbit. The boy's grave contained a straightened mammoth ivory spear, over 2 meters long, a feat of engineering and heating rare for the period. Some researchers suggest the grave is ritual theatre, a performance of grief for a community whose worldview required symmetry, pairing, or balance in the afterlife. But there's another, more sombre possibility. Perhaps the children weren't buried as symbols at all, but as symbols of tragedy. A community's heartbreak. The Sunhir people were nomadic, Ice Age hunter-gatherers. Life was hard, food was scarce, most people died before reaching old age, and yet the sheer investment of time and resources into these burials tells us something profound. They loved these children, not just biologically, but socially, emotionally, perhaps even spiritually. Mainstream fact. Unlike other Paleolithic burials, which often contain simple grave goods or none at all, the Sunghir burials are so ornate that some anthropologists call them Ice Age cathedrals. Thousands of beads, hundreds of hours, tools forged for use, then entombed forever. All for children, not warriors, not leaders, just children. This speaks to the dawn of something uniquely human, communal grief, and the understanding that death, especially young death, wounds the group in ways no animal instinct prepares us for. It's not just that the boy died, it's that he was missed. How did they die? This is the mystery. None of the bodies at Sunghir show visible signs of trauma. No broken bones, no spear wounds, no infection in the bones. They may have died of illness, exposure, malnutrition, or something completely invisible to time. Scholars still debate whether the children at Sunghir died from natural causes, disease, or ritual death, though most now lean toward illness or plague. But there's something else odd. The children's limbs are unusually short compared to their torsos. This may suggest a genetic disorder, or perhaps they were part of a subgroup within the larger community. Were they ostracized, protected, or were their differences the very reason for the elaborate burial? Quirky tidbit. Some researchers suggest the children's symmetrical burial might represent a mythic story or cosmological belief, a mirror world of life and death. Their bodies, perfectly arranged, don't scream violence, but they whisper sorrow, the pain that stays. Unlike other painful deaths we've explored, ripped apart by predators, burned alive, speared in the back, this pain isn't physical, it's psychological, cultural, relational. What makes the Sungir burial so haunting is the presence of love in the archaeological record. We can't know the rituals, we can't read their minds, but we can see the work, the devotion, etched into every ivory bead, every placed foxtooth, every smoothed stone.
Mainstream fact. The ivory beads found at Sungir were carved from woolly mammoth tusks, indicating long-term planning and specialized craftsmanship. This wasn't a reaction to sudden death. This was a ritual built over weeks, a prolonged goodbye, a communal processing of grief. And that's what makes it so painful. Not the death itself, but the awareness of death, and the ache it leaves behind. Why it matters. Sungir doesn't show us the earliest humans, or the most technologically advanced. It shows us something rarer, early emotional depth. The understanding that death is not just a loss, but a story. That we can shape that story in how we remember, how we mourn, how we preserve. In that snowy grave, someone looked at those children and thought they mattered, and then spent hundreds of hours proving it, one bead at a time. Scholars still debate whether the Sungir culture had formal religious beliefs, or whether these burials represent the beginnings of such a system, but the outcome is the same. In life, these children played. In death, they were enshrined. Final reflections. What is the most painful death? So, across these 10 chapters, we've seen pain in every form. Clawed limbs in South Africa, spear-pierced backs in Germany, burned bones in China, children dressed in beads in the Russian snow. But the most painful death? It may not be the most violent. It may not be the slowest. It may not even be your own. It might be the one you watch, the one you bury, the one that leaves you behind. Sungir is a graveyard of sorrow, but it is also a monument to memory. And perhaps, in that, the greatest pain is also the greatest gift, to feel deeply, to remember fiercely, to mourn fully. In their silence, the dead still speak. And sometimes, they whisper not just of pain, but of love. Conclusion. In the long shadows of our prehistory, death was never far. It stalked the weak, the young, the unlucky. It came as fire, as fang, as famine. It came with ice and spear, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, with silence. But in each painful death we've unearthed, we also find something else, a mirror, one that reflects not only what our ancestors suffered, but who they were becoming. We saw in these ancient corpses the flickers of empathy, of planning, of storytelling. Pain did not simply end a life, it left an imprint on others. From the shattered skulls at Shanidar to the scorched bones at Joman, we've seen how pain shaped not just bodies, but beliefs. How it spurred rituals, mythologies, and bonds that outlived the flesh. The most painful deaths in prehistory weren't just about suffering, they were about meaning. And perhaps, in understanding them, we better understand the one story we all share, the one that ends and yet echoes on.